The white envelope sat there on the mahogany dining room table like a bomb about to explode. My fingers trembled as I watched my family gathered around the Christmas tree, their laughter echoing through the 3-story colonial mansion that was once my home. The scent of cinnamon and pine lingered in the air, mingled with the aroma of the roast turkey Mom always prepared the day before. But for me, that sweet smell had turned bitter, almost nauseating. It was December 23rd, 2023, and I was about to deliver the most expensive gift in Henderson family history. 42 years of life, and this would be the first time I wouldn't spend Christmas with them. Not because I didn't want to, God knows I did, but because I simply wasn't invited. The discovery had come to me 3 weeks earlier through a photo on my niece Katie's Instagram. There they all were, my younger brother Derek with his perfect wife Jennifer, my older sister Patricia with her 15-year-old twins, and my parents, Robert and Eleanor Henderson, smiling for the camera as they decorated the family tree. The caption read, "Can't wait for our intimate Christmas this year." The word intimate cut through my soul like a sharp blade. For years I had been the black sheep of the family, not because I was a criminal or an addict, but because I had made decisions they considered unbecoming of a Henderson. I married a man they considered inferior, an honest mechanic named Michael, rather than a lawyer or doctor as they had hoped. I moved into a modest apartment in Queens, instead of buying a house in Manhattan as my inheritance would have allowed. And worst of all, I refused to work at the family firm, Henderson and Associates, which had managed investments for wealthy families for 3 generations. But what they didn't know was that, over the past 15 years, I had built my own empire. It started as a small blog about investing for everyday people, written at my kitchen table while Michael worked the night shift. I had applied everything I learned from watching my father manage wealth, but adapted that knowledge for middle-class families. The blog grew, became a YouTube channel, then a consulting firm, and finally transformed into Finance for All, a platform that democratized access to sophisticated investment strategies. The irony was delicious. While my family looked down on me, thinking I'd wasted my potential, I'd amassed a fortune of $57 million, more than any of them had ever dreamed of. And most importantly, I'd done it alone, without using a penny of family money or the Henderson name to open doors. Every dollar had been earned with sweat, tears, and sleepless nights strategizing while the world slept. The plan began to take shape when I got Mom's phone call, 3 days after seeing the photo. Her voice was cool, almost professional, as if she were talking to a stranger. "Sarah, dear," she said, and I already knew something was wrong from her formal tone. "This year we decided to have a more reserved Christmas. You understand, don't you? With the tough economy, we thought it best to keep things simple." The tough economy? I almost laughed. The Hendersons owned 3 houses, 4 luxury cars, and a bank account that never dipped below 8 figures. "The financial situation?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Didn't Father tell me business is going well?" There was a long pause on the other end, and I could hear the ticking of the antique clock in her office. "Well, yes, business is good. It's just Derek and Jennifer are going through a rough patch in their marriage, and Patricia thinks it would be better if it were just us being closer." You understand, don't you? The lie was so obvious, it was almost offensive. I knew from mutual contacts that Derek and Jennifer had just returned from a second honeymoon in Paris. That night, lying next to Michael in our king-size bed, bought with my own money, thank you, I made a decision. If they wanted to exclude me, fine. But I wouldn't quietly slip away, not after years of swallowing put-downs, passive-aggressive comments about my life choices, and pitying looks at family gatherings. It was time for them to find out who Sarah Henderson had truly become. The envelope I held contained more than money. It contained my Declaration of Independence. Inside was a check for $5 million made out to the Henderson family, along with a letter I had rewritten dozens of times until I found the right words. Not words of anger or resentment, but words that would reveal the truth about who I was and what I had accomplished while they ignored me. Michael had tried to dissuade me from the idea. Sarah, you don't have to prove anything to them, he said, holding my hands as I typed the letter on my laptop. We know who you are. That should be enough. But it wasn't enough. Not for me. For years, I'd carried the burden of being considered the failed daughter. And now I had the chance to flip that script once and for all. The letter explained in detail how I had built my fortune. Every milestone, every smart decision, every calculated risk that had brought me here. It spoke of the nights I spent poring over financial reports while they slept in their comfortable beds, of the weekends I dedicated to building my company while they played golf at exclusive clubs. And at the end, it offered the check for $5 million as a Christmas present to the family who always believed in me. The sarcasm was subtle, but it was there. Anyone who truly knew me would understand that those words were laced with irony. The gift wasn't just money. It was a lesson in underestimating people, in judging others by appearances, in the price of familial arrogance. Now, standing on the porch of the house where I grew up, watching them through the living room window, I felt a strange mix of sadness and determination. The house seemed smaller than I remembered, or perhaps I had grown more than I realized. The colorful Christmas lights twinkled merrily, creating a stark contrast to the emotional storm brewing inside me. I took a deep breath, the cold December air burning my lungs, and walked to the front door. It was time to deliver my parting gift. I rang the doorbell once, the familiar sound echoing through the house. Footsteps approached, and I immediately recognized the rhythm of my father's walk. When he opened the door, his expression changed from surprise to something that resembled embarrassment. "Sarah," he said, and his voice sounded different, older, more tired. "What are you doing here?" "I came to deliver a Christmas present," I replied, holding out the envelope. "For the whole family." He eyed the envelope as if it were a venomous snake, but finally picked it up with hesitant fingers. "Sarah, about us not inviting you this year. It was a misunderstanding. Your mother—" "Don't worry, Dad," I interrupted, forcing a smile. "I understand perfectly. Open the envelope when everyone is gathered. It's important that the whole family is present." I turned to leave, but he gently grabbed my arm. "Aren't you going in? Maybe we can talk." His voice held a note of pleading I'd never heard before. "No, Dad, not this time." I looked at him one last time, memorizing his face. "But I'm sure you'll have plenty to talk about after you read what's in there." And with that, I walked back to my car, leaving Robert Henderson standing in the doorway, holding the envelope that would change everything forever. I drove to the Starbucks on the corner of Fifth Avenue, the same one I used to go to high school, and sat at the corner table overlooking the family home. It was a strategic position that would allow me to watch the moment they discovered the envelope's contents. My heart was beating like a military drum, and my hands were shaking so badly I spilled coffee on the table twice. 23 minutes. That's exactly how long it took for the living room lights to start flickering on and off strangely, as if someone were pacing nervously around the house, compulsively turning switches on and off. The first sign that the envelope had been opened came in the form of a familiar silhouette in the second-story window. My mother, Eleanor, pacing back and forth in Dad's office. Even from a distance, I could recognize her dramatic gestures, her hands going through her hair, the rigid posture she always adopted when processing shocking information. I remembered how she'd reacted the same way when she found out Patricia had failed calculus at Yale, or when Derek announced he wanted to get married at 22. But this was different. This was an emotional atomic bomb I detonated right in the middle of her perfect Christmas. My phone vibrated. A call from Dad. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Immediately, it vibrated again. This time it was Derek. I ignored it too. Then Patricia. Then Mom. In 15 minutes, I had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. I hadn't read any of them, not yet. I wanted them to taste the hopelessness, the feeling of screaming into the void and getting no response. That's exactly how I felt for years, trying to prove myself to a family that had decided I wasn't worth it. The front door burst open, and Derek ran toward his BMW, even from a distance. I could see he was on the phone, gesturing wildly. probably calling his accountant or lawyer, trying to verify the check was real. The thought made me smile for the first time in weeks. Yes, Derek, the money is real. Every penny of it. And no, you can't just make it disappear or pretend it never happened. Jennifer appeared in the doorway, still wearing the red Christmas sweater I'd seen in the Instagram photos. She grabbed Derek's arm, pulling him back inside. Even from a distance, I could see she was crying. Jennifer had always been the most emotional in the family. She cried at dog commercials and got emotional reading Christmas cards. But these weren't tears of holiday joy. They were tears of shock, maybe even guilt, because deep down, they all knew they'd treated me badly over the years. The lights in the second-floor office stayed on all night. I knew because I sat there, in my car parked across the street, watching as a private investigator observes the target of an investigation. At 2 a.m, I saw Dad at the window, still wearing his blue dress shirt, running his hands through his gray hair. At 3:30, Mom appeared beside him and I could see them talking intensely. Their shadows moved against the curtains like characters in a puppet show, and I was the only spectator in this dramatic play. My phone finally stopped ringing at 4 a.m. In total, there had been 78 attempts to contact me. I finally decided to read the messages one by one, savoring every word of desperation, confusion, and finally, recognition. The first was from Derek. "Sarah, for the love of God, answer the phone. We need to talk about this now." The second was from Patricia. "I can't believe what I'm seeing. How did you get so much money? Is this legal?" And the third was from Dad. "Daughter, call me. Please, we have a lot to talk about." But it was Mom's message that made me swallow hard. At 3:47 a.m., she'd written, "Sarah, darling, I'm so sorry." "I'm so sorry. I had no idea what you'd accomplished. Please come home. Let's talk as a family." The word family sounded strange coming from her, especially after she'd excluded me from the most important family gathering of the year. But there was something about the message that resonated with me. Maybe it was the "I'm sorry," words Eleanor Henderson rarely uttered. I drove back home, my real home, the Queen's apartment I shared with Michael as the sun began to rise over Manhattan. The drive gave me time to process what I had just done. There was no going back. The envelope had been delivered, the truth had been exposed, and now I would have to deal with the consequences. Michael was waiting for me in the kitchen, already dressed for work, with a steaming cup of coffee in his hands and that worried expression I knew so well. "So?" he asked, pulling me into a tight hug. His familiar scent, a mix of Irish Spring soap and the detergent we used at the laundry room, brought me back to reality. "Did you deliver?" I nodded against his chest, suddenly feeling exhausted. "How do you feel?" I considered the question for a moment. How did I feel? Relieved, vindicated, regretful? It was impossible to define. I felt like someone who had just jumped off a cliff and was still free-falling, unsure if there was a parachute or rocks waiting below. "They've been calling all night," I murmured. 78 times, Michael whistled softly. "And you're going to call them back?" The question echoed in the quiet kitchen, mixing with the noise of the morning traffic outside. "I don't know, maybe, but not today. Today they can be wondering, planning what they'll say, rehearsing excuses. I want them to feel what it's like to be ignored, even if it's just for a few hours." At 10 a.m, the doorbell rang. Michael had left for work, and I was in the makeshift office I'd set up in the guest room, checking company emails. When I opened the door, I found a delivery man holding the largest bouquet of roses I'd ever seen. It must have been at least 5 dozen red, yellow, and white roses, arranged so elaborately it looked like something out of a movie. The card read, "To Sarah, with love and respect from the Henderson family. Please give us a chance to talk. We'll be waiting." The irony was almost comical. For years, they had forgotten my birthday, sent generic Christmas cards and gift cards without any personal thought. Now suddenly, I was receiving flowers that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Money had that power. It turned invisible people into priorities, converted indifference into desperate attention. 2 hours later, a second delivery arrived. This time, it was Derek himself, standing at my door with an expression that mixed humility and despair. He looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. His eyes were red, probably from lack of sleep, and his always impeccable clothes were wrinkled. "Sarah," he said when I opened the door, "may I come in, please?" His voice sounded small, vulnerable, a far cry from the arrogant tone he usually used when speaking to me. I hesitated for a moment, watching my younger brother on my doorstep. Derek, who had always been the golden child, the heir apparent to the family business, the boy who could do anything wrong and still be forgiven. Now he was here, asking permission to enter my home, my territory. 5 minutes, I finally said, stepping aside to let him pass. He looked around the apartment with a strange expression, as if seeing everything for the first time. And perhaps he was. On the few occasions my family visited my home, they always seemed uncomfortable, making subtle comments about the charm of the modest decor or the practicality of the small space. Now, Derek observed every detail with fresh eyes. The business books on the bookshelf, the top-of-the-line computer in the makeshift office, the diplomas and certifications framed on the wall. "Sarah," he began, sitting hesitantly on the couch. We didn't know about your company, about the money, about nothing." His words came out brokenly, as if he were having trouble forming coherent thoughts. $57 million? How is that possible? When did it happen? The question contained years of underestimation crystallized in a few words. How is that possible? As if my success was some inexplicable phenomenon, a cosmic accident that defied all logic. "It happened gradually," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Over the past 15 years. While you were busy ignoring me, I was busy building an empire." The word empire sounded more dramatic than I intended, but Derek didn't seem to notice. He was staring at his hands as if processing information he couldn't accept. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" The question came out almost as a whisper. It was the question I'd anticipated, and I had a ready answer. "When? During the family dinners where you talked about how much money you spent on vacation while I ate in silence? During the family gatherings where Patricia complained about common people problems while you laughed? Or maybe during the Christmas phone calls that lasted exactly 3 minutes because you had more important things to do?" Derek closed his eyes, as if my words were physical blows. "Sarah, we've made mistakes, lots of mistakes. But $5 million, you didn't have to do that. It was a lot of money too." He stopped mid-sentence, probably realizing how absurd his concern sounded. A lot of money for what? For a lesson? In humility? For a family that had more money than they knew what to do with? "For you, $5 million is a lot of money," I replied calmly. "For me, it's less than 10% of what I have. It's what I call life lesson money." Derek's expression changed completely as the words registered. He looked at me as if I were a stranger, as if the sister he thought he knew had been replaced by a completely different woman overnight. "Less than 10%? He repeated, his voice barely audible. "Sarah, are you telling me you have over $50 million? I nodded slowly, savoring the moment. For years I had dreamed of this very second, the moment my family would finally understand they had underestimated the wrong person. 57.2 million to be exact, I replied, crossing my legs and leaning back in my chair. According to my accountant's latest report, last week. Of course, the numbers change daily with investments, but this is the current average. Derek ran his hand over his face, a gesture I recognized from our father when he was processing complex financial information. It was surreal to see my younger brother, who had always treated me like an irresponsible child, trying to understand that I had accumulated more wealth than he had ever dreamed. How, was all he could say. A simple word that carried decades of family incomprehension. How did you do this without anyone knowing? How did you build a company this size working alone? I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the busy Queens Street. Below, normal people were going about their normal lives. Workers returning from the morning shift, mothers taking children to school, retirees walking their dogs. It was my world, very different from the isolated Manhattan universe where my family lived. "Remember when you laughed at me for starting a finance blog?" I asked, still staring out the window. "It was in 2008 during the financial crisis. You were at the golf club, complaining about how ignorant ordinary people were about money, and I said I wanted to help you. Dad laughed and said it was a waste of time teaching pigs to fly." The memory still stung, but now it had a different flavor, the sweet taste of vindication. "That blog you thought was ridiculous got 3 million views in its first year." Derek stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth across my small living room. It was a habit he'd inherited from our father, walking in circles when he was nervous or processing important information. 3 million views, he muttered as if talking to himself. "So what? How did that turn into? This?" He gestured vaguely as if this were something indefinable and impossible to grasp. "I work hard," I replied simply. 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, for years. While you slept, I was studying market trends. While you were at social dinners, I was creating content. While you were vacationing in the Hamptons, I was developing investment algorithms." Each word was a small dagger, reminding him of all the times they had chosen pleasure over work, status over substance. "But Sarah," he interrupted, stopping in his tracks and looking me straight in the eye, "why didn't you ask for help? Why didn't you use your family connections? Dad knows everyone on Wall Street. We could have." I laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the room. "We could have what, Derek? Helped me? The same family who said my marriage to Michael was a mistake? The same family who thought my move to Queens was a step backward? The same family who never asked how I was doing financially because they assumed I was broke?" The truth hung heavy in the air between us like a toxic cloud. Derek knew I was right, and that made everything more painful for him. For years, they had operated under the assumption that I was the failed daughter, the one in need of charity and condescension. The idea that I not only didn't need their help but had surpassed them all financially shook the foundations of how they viewed our family dynamic. YouTube came later, I continued, returning to my chair. People wanted to see the face behind the blog. I started making videos at my kitchen table, explaining basic investment concepts. A video about how to invest with $100 went viral. 2 million views in a week. Derek looked at me as if I were telling a science fiction story. To him, the online world was a mystery. He still paid his accountant to manage his personal finances and thought Instagram was for teenagers. 2 million, he repeated, shaking his head. And Mom and Dad knew about that. The question carried an accusatory note, as if I had an obligation to keep them informed about every aspect of my life. "Derek, how many times have you asked about my work in the last 15 years? How many times have you shown genuine interest in what I do beyond the cute blog?" He opened his mouth to answer, but closed it again. We both knew the answer. 0. The consulting business came naturally after my YouTube success. People watched my videos and wanted personalized advice. I started charging $50 per consultation, making video calls from my kitchen after Michael went to bed. Within 6 months, I had a 3-week waiting list and had raised my rates to $200 an hour. "Do you know who my first big client was?" I asked Derek. "The wife of one of the partners at the law firm where Dad plays poker every Tuesday." Derek frowned in confusion. "But Dad never mentioned—" "Exactly," I interrupted, "because she asked me not to. She said her husband would find it embarrassing that she was asking the failed Henderson daughter for financial advice." The irony was almost poetic. My first major client paying $500 an hour to learn investment strategies I'd developed on my own, while my own father viewed her as inferior for being married to a divorce lawyer instead of a senior partner. "Sarah," Derek said, his voice thick with something that might have been regret, "we didn't know you felt this way. that you thought we saw you as a failure. It was typical of him to try to dismiss decades of family condescension as a misunderstanding. Derek, you literally called me our family charity project at Thanksgiving dinner in 2019, right in front of me, while laughing. He paled, probably remembering the exact moment. The Finance for All platform had been my masterstroke. After years of building my reputation through blogging, YouTube, and consulting, I had a wealth of data on what ordinary people really needed to manage their money. Not the vague, elitist advice traditional companies offered, but practical, accessible strategies. I launched the platform in 2020, I explained, right in the middle of the pandemic. Do you know how many people signed up in the first month? Derek shook his head. 47,000, each paying $29 a month. He paused to do the mental math. Over $1 million a month in recurring revenue. Finally, he was grasping the magnitude of what I had created. And that was just the beginning. Today, we have 320,000 paying subscribers, plus the premium courses, plus the corporate consulting, plus the books, plus the bank partnerships. Each number was a piece of the puzzle my family never bothered to put together. Too busy with their own privileged lives to notice the empire I was building just a few miles away. 320,000, Derek muttered, doing more calculations. Jesus Christ, Sarah, that's almost $10 million a month in subscriptions alone. I nodded calmly, as if we were discussing the weather, and growing 15% every quarter. Last year, Finance for All was valued at $120 million by a venture capital firm looking to buy a stake. I declined the offer. Derek slumped onto the couch, as if his legs could no longer support the weight of these revelations. You turned down $120 million? His voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah, do you understand that this is more money than our entire family has ever seen? That was the fundamental difference between us. Derek saw money as an end goal. I saw it as a tool. I turned it down because the company is worth more, much more. And because I didn't build this to sell, I built it to change the way normal people handle money. It was a concept my family, raised in a world of elite investing and inherited wealth, would never fully grasp. My phone rang, breaking the heavy silence that had settled between us. It was Michael, probably calling from work to see how my date with Derek had gone. I ignored the call, but the sound seemed to have roused my brother from his stupor. Sarah, he said, his voice firmer now, we need to talk to Mom and Dad, to Patricia. As a family, all together. The word family again, as if it were a magical talisman that could erase years of emotional neglect. Now you want to talk as a family? I asked, raising an eyebrow. After you excluded me from Christmas, after you found out I have more money than you know what to do with? Derek had the decency to look embarrassed. You want to talk to me because I'm rich, not because I'm your sister. If I were the same person, but still living on a salary, you'd still be celebrating your private Christmas without me. Derek was silent for several minutes, staring at his clasped hands. When he finally looked up, I saw something I'd never seen before in my younger brother. Genuine vulnerability. You're right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And it kills me inside, Sarah. It kills me to know we're the kind of family that only values people for their money. His words carried the weight of years of misperceptions, of hasty judgments, of missed opportunities to truly know me. It was as if he was seeing our family dynamic for the first time, through my eyes. Do you remember my wedding? I asked, standing and walking to the bookshelf where I kept some photos. I picked up a framed photo of my wedding to Michael, a simple ceremony in a small church in Queens with only 40 people. Remember Dad's speech? Derek swallowed. Of course he did. Robert Henderson had given an awkward speech about how I was exploring different paths in life, and how he was hopeful I'd find my place eventually. At the time, I thought it was just parental awkwardness. Now I understood it was pure condescension. He was trying to be kind, Derek murmured, but his words rang hollow even to himself. Kind, I repeated, putting the photo back. Derek, he talked about me like I was a rebellious teenager going through a phase. I was 27, had a business degree from NYU, and had already started building my consulting firm. But to you, I was just the daughter who'd lost herself by marrying a mechanic. The word mechanic came out. With all the bitterness accumulated over the years of hearing my family talk about Michael as if he were inferior. Michael's a good man, Derek said, and for a moment it sounded sincere. I've always known that, but... He paused, searching for the right words. But we were raised with certain expectations, certain standards, and when you chose a different path, you decided I'd failed, I finished for him. Without even trying to understand my choice, without asking if I was happy, without caring that Michael supported me in every business decision I made, that he worked double shifts so I could invest our money in video equipment. The truth about Michael was something my family had never bothered to find out. They saw a mechanic from Queens and stopped there. They didn't see the man who had graduated with an engineering degree overnight, who understood more about technology than any of them, who had been my first investor when I needed $5,000 for professional recording equipment. Do you know how much Michael invested in Finance for All in the early years? I asked Derek. $87,000. Our entire savings. Without hesitation, without question. Just absolute confidence in my potential. 87,000, Derek repeated, clearly impressed. Where did he get that money from? The question revealed exactly the kind of prejudice I was fighting. He owns 3 auto repair shops, Derek. And before you ask, yes, they're legitimate and very profitable businesses. Michael is an entrepreneur just like me. The difference is he works with cars instead of computers. It was ironic how my family, who preached the value of hard work and entrepreneurial initiative, couldn't recognize those same qualities in Michael simply because he didn't wear a suit. Derek ran his hands through his hair, a frustrated gesture I knew well. Sarah, we made terrible mistakes. We judged you, we judged Michael, we judged your choices without really knowing the facts. It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever hear from a family member. And part of me wanted to accept it, wanted to hug him and tell him it was okay. But it wasn't okay. Decades of subtle slights couldn't be erased with a few words of regret. What really hurts me, I continued, returning to my chair, isn't that you misjudged me. It's that you never took the time to really get to know me. How many times did you ask about my dreams, my fears, my plans? When was the last time someone in the family asked how I was doing, genuinely interested in the answer? Derek opened and closed his mouth several times, like a fish out of water. The truth was they never had. Our family conversations always revolved around Dad's business, Patricia's children, Derek's work. And now, I said, my voice taking on a hardness I hadn't known I possessed, you want to meet me because you found out I'm rich. You want to include the millionaire sister in family gatherings. You want to associate yourself with my success after years of treating me like a charity project. Every word was carefully chosen for maximum emotional impact. I had learned in business that sometimes you have to be cruel to be honest. Derek stood abruptly, pacing again. It's not about the money, he protested, but his voice held no conviction. Or at least not just about the money. Sarah, you're our sister. We love you. The word love sounded strange coming from him. When was the last time anyone in my family had said they loved me? When was the last time they'd shown that love through actions instead of empty words? Do you love me? I asked, tilting my head. Derek, you didn't invite me to Christmas, the most important family gathering of the year, and I wasn't on the list. How does that even look like love? He stopped walking, turning to face me directly. That was a mistake, a terrible mistake. Mom was worried you'd be uncomfortable with all the talk about money and... Stop, I interrupted, holding up my hand. Don't make excuses. We both know the truth. The truth was, they had grown comfortable with my absence. It was easier to have family gatherings without the black sheep, without the person who reminded them that not all Hendersons followed the traditional path. It was easier to talk about their successes without having to include the sister they felt had wasted her potential. You didn't miss me, he said calmly. You felt relief at not having to feign interest in my mediocre life. That's not true, Derek protested, but his voice was losing strength. Sarah, we always ask about you. We always worry. When? I interrupted again. When did you ask about me? During the 2-minute calls on my birthday? During the family dinners where you discussed your problems while I ate in silence? Or maybe during the 15 years I built my company without receiving a single phone call, asking how it was going? The silence that followed was deafening. Derek had completely stopped walking and stood in the middle of my living room like a statue. I could see the gears turning in his head, processing decades of emotional neglect, recognizing patterns of behavior he'd probably never even consciously noticed. It was like watching someone awaken from a long, uncomfortable dream. My God, he finally murmured. Sarah, we really failed you, didn't we? It was the first time I'd heard a member of my family take full responsibility for their actions, without excuses or justifications. And for a moment, just a moment, I felt a spark of the brotherly love I'd tried to bury for so long. But it was too late for sparks. The fire had long since died out, smothered by years of indifference. Yes, I replied simply. You failed, and now you want a second chance because you've discovered I'm not the failure you thought I was. I stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the world. But here's the thing about second chances, Derek. They have to be earned, and you have to decide whether you want to know me for who I am or for what I have. Derek remained silent for long minutes, and I could feel the weight of his thoughts filling the space between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. What if we said we want to know you for who you are? What if we said we're willing to start over, truly start over? It was an honest, vulnerable question, and for a moment I considered the possibility. So, I said, turning to face him, you'd have to prove it. Not with words, but with actions. And the first action would be to understand that I don't need you. Not financially, not emotionally, not at all. If you want to be a part of my life, it'll have to be because I choose to let you in, not because you think you're entitled to it. It was my line in the sand, my final ultimatum, and from the look on Derek's face, he understood exactly what was at stake. After Derek left, the house fell eerily silent. I could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock, the distant hum of traffic outside, the sounds of neighbors going about their normal lives. But inside my mind, there was a hurricane of emotions I was struggling to process. For 15 years, I had fantasized about this moment, the moment my family would finally recognize my worth. But now that it was happening, I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd hoped for. Instead, there was a strange emptiness, as if I'd won a battle, but lost something important in the process. My phone rang again. This time it was Patricia, my older sister. I hesitated before answering, knowing she would be much more direct and possibly cruel than Derek. Patricia had never learned the art of diplomacy. She attacked problems head-on, like an emotional bulldozer. Sarah, her voice sounded strained over the phone. We need to talk, now. There wasn't even a hi or how are you. It was typical Patricia, always treating conversations like business negotiations that needed to be concluded quickly and with maximum efficiency. Hello, Patricia, I replied calmly. How was your intimate Christmas? I could hear the discomfort in the silence that followed. Sarah, let's not pretend this isn't about the envelope. $5 million? Seriously, what are you trying to prove? Her voice carried a mix of incredulity and irritation I knew well. It was the tone she used when her teenagers did something she considered immature or unnecessary. I'm not trying to prove anything, I replied, sitting down on the still warm couch where Derek had spent the last hour. I'm just giving my family a Christmas present. Isn't that what families do? The sarcasm in my voice was unmistakable, but Patricia chose to ignore it. A $5 million gift isn't normal, Sarah. It's ostentation. It's you trying to make us feel small. The accusation took me by surprise. For years, they had made me feel small, and now that the tables were turned, they didn't like it. Do you feel small? I asked, genuinely curious. Interesting. How do you think I felt all these years being treated like a family disappointment? Patricia sighed deeply, and I could picture her in her marble kitchen, probably preparing a gourmet dinner while chatting with me. She'd always been a multitasker, unable to focus on just one thing at a time. "Sarah, we've never treated you like a disappointment. You're our little sister, and we've always wanted to protect you." Protect? The word came out louder than I intended. "Patricia, you excluded me from Christmas. How is that protection?" There was another silence, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost hesitant. It was a mistake. Mom was worried you'd be uncomfortable with all the talk about the business doing well, about Dad's new investments. She thought it would be hard for you to hear about financial success when you're... She stopped abruptly, realizing what she was about to say. "When I'm what, Patricia?" I persisted, savoring her moment of discomfort. "When I'm broke? When I'm struggling financially? Is that what you think of me?" The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "Patricia, I have more money than all of you combined. Much more." It was the second time I'd made this revelation today, and it didn't get any less impactful the more I repeated it. "That's impossible," she said, but her voice carried less conviction than her words suggested. "Sarah, where would you get... How much money do you have?" The question came out almost as a whisper, as if she were afraid of the answer. $57.2 million, I replied calmly. "Liquid, not counting the company's assets, which are worth significantly more." I could hear what sounded like a plate being dropped on her end of the phone. $57 million, she repeated, her voice barely audible. "How? When?" "Sarah, where did this money come from?" It was the same question Derek had asked, but coming from Patricia, it carried a note of suspicion that irritated me deeply. "Are you suggesting I got this money illegally?" I asked, my voice taking on a hardness that made Patricia flinch immediately. No, of course not. It's a lot of money, Sarah. More money than a loser like me should have." I finished for her. "I never said you were a failure," Patricia protested, but we both knew she'd thought that for years. "Maybe not in those exact words," I conceded, "but your actions spoke louder than words. When was the last time you called me just to talk? When was the last time you asked about my business, my dreams, my life?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with years of family neglect. Patricia began, but couldn't finish the sentence. Because there was no answer. In 15 years of building my company, my older sister had called me maybe 10 times, and always out of family obligation, birthdays, holidays, occasionally to invite me to some social event where I clearly didn't fit in. "Patricia, do you know the name of my company?" I asked softly. Silence. "Do you know what kind of business I have?" Besides something with computers. The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with something that sounded like shame. "Sarah, we assumed that you weren't doing well financially. You live in Queens, you have no children, Michael works as a mechanic." It was fascinating how my family managed to turn all my life choices into evidence of failure. Queens, as if it were a ghetto. No children, as if I were incomplete. Michael being a mechanic, as if honest work was something to be ashamed of. And because I live in Queens and am married to a mechanic, you assumed I was poor, she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Patricia, do you know how much apartments in Park Slope cost these days?" She probably didn't. People like Patricia didn't pay attention to real estate prices in neighborhoods they considered inferior. "Our apartment is worth $1.2 million. I bought it cash in 2018. In sight?" The incredulity in her voice was almost comical. "Sarah, how did you have over $1 million in 2018? It was as if I were telling her science fiction stories. The concept that I could have built a significant fortune while they ignored me was seemingly impossible to process. "Hard work, Patricia. Something you seem to have forgotten exists outside the world of family investments and inherited wealth." "But Sarah," she insisted, and I could hear the frustration rising in her voice. "Why didn't you ever tell us? Why did you keep it a secret about having so much money?" It was the same question Derek had asked, and it demonstrated a fundamental lack of self-awareness that made me simultaneously sad and furious. "When should I have told you, Patricia? During the family dinners, where you complained about how much money you were spending on private school for your kids? During the conversations where Dad discussed his 7-figure investments, when you were too busy talking about your own lives to notice mine? The confrontation was taking a turn I hadn't anticipated. I expected denial, perhaps anger, possibly even accusations. But what I was getting was something more complex, a mixture of shock, shame, and what felt like the beginnings of a painful self-awareness. "Sarah," Patricia finally said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "We make mistakes. Big mistakes. But we're family. That has to count for something." "Family," I repeated, savoring the word like bitter wine. "Patricia, families support each other. Families celebrate each other's successes. Families include all members in important occasions. Have you done any of these things to me in the last 15 years? It wasn't a rhetorical question. I genuinely wanted her to think about it, to process decades of emotional neglect disguised as normal family dynamics. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Through the window, I could see an elegant, middle-aged woman standing at my door, holding an expensive handbag and looking around with the slightly uncomfortable expression wealthy people always have when they find themselves in middle-class neighborhoods. It was my mother. Eleanor Henderson had come in person, something that hadn't happened in over 3 years. "Patricia," she said into the phone, "Mom just arrived at my door. I'm going to have to hang up. Wait, Sarah." But I had already hung up. I took a deep breath, smoothing my clothes and mentally preparing myself for what promised to be the most difficult conversation of the day. Eleanor Henderson was a force of nature, diplomatic when convenient, ruthless when necessary, and always, always in control. But now she was outside my door, on my turf, holding an envelope that had completely changed the family dynamic. For the first time in decades, I was in charge. I opened the door and found my mother in all her intimidating glory. Eleanor Henderson never left the house without being impeccably dressed, even for an emergency visit to the daughter she had excluded from Christmas 24 hours earlier. She wore a black Burberry wool coat, Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than most people spent on clothes in an entire year, and carried the Hermès bag I had given her for her birthday 3 years ago, a gift that, at the time, represented almost all my savings, but which she had accepted with a polite smile and a comment about how I shouldn't try so hard. Now, looking at that bag, I mentally calculated that I could buy 10 like it without blinking. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice carrying that natural authority that always made me feel like a child again. But today, for the first time, her presence didn't automatically diminish me. I stepped away from the door, gesturing for her to enter, watching as her eyes scanned my apartment with that quick, subtle assessment that society women instinctively make. She was cataloging every detail, the furniture, the decor, the appliances, probably trying to reconcile what she saw with her previous perception of my financial situation. "Coffee?" I offered, more out of courtesy than genuine hospitality. She nodded, sitting carefully on the sofa, as if testing its quality before trusting it completely. As I prepared the coffee in the kitchen, I could feel her eyes following me and imagined the gears turning in her meticulously organized mind. Eleanor Henderson had always been a strategist, thinking 3 moves ahead in any social or family situation. But today, she was in unfamiliar territory, forced to recalibrate years of assumptions about her youngest daughter. I returned with 2 cups, fine china I'd bought at Tiffany's the year before, another small luxury my family would never know I could afford. "Thank you," she said, taking the cup and immediately noticing its quality. Her fingers traced the rim delicately, and I saw the exact moment she recognized the brand. "Tiffany," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "I didn't know you had—" She stopped abruptly, realizing she was voicing her assumptions about my financial standing. "Didn't know I had what, Mom?" I asked, sitting in the chair across from her. Didn't know I had good taste? Or didn't know I could afford nice things? The question hung in the air between us, laden with years of subtle condescension and unspoken assumptions. Eleanor sipped her coffee, taking the time to choose her words carefully. It was a tactic I recognized. She always did it when navigating delicate conversations. "Sarah." "Dear," she began, her voice taking on that maternal tone she always used when she wanted to be persuasive. "We need to talk about what happened last night. About the envelope." The word came out hesitantly, as if it were difficult to pronounce. For Eleanor Henderson, money had never been a sensitive topic. It was a tool, a means of exerting power and influence. But now she was faced with a situation where her daughter had demonstrated more financial power than she knew how to process. "Of course," I replied calmly. "What would you like to know about the envelope?" My voice was neutral, professional, as if we were discussing the weather. It was a technique I'd learned in business negotiations. The calmer you remain while the other person is agitated, the more control you have over the situation. And Eleanor was definitely agitated, even if she was doing an excellent job hiding it. $5 million, Sarah." She said the words slowly, as if testing how they sounded out loud. "That's an extraordinary amount of money." "More money than—" She trailed off, clearly struggling with something. "More money than you thought I could have," I finished for her. "Mommy, how much do you think I make a year?" The question caught her off guard. She blinked several times, clearly uncomfortable with the direct direction of the conversation. "Well, we assume you and Michael live comfortably but modestly. Maybe 80,000, 90,000 a year combined." The estimate was so low I almost laughed. 80,000 combined. I made more than that in a good week. "Mom, I made $17 million last year. Just me. That's over $46,000 a day, including weekends." The numbers rolled off my tongue as easily as I would tell the time of day, but I saw the impact they made on my mother's carefully composed face. 17 million, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Per year?" I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee and watching her process this information. "How?" was all she could manage. It was the same question Derek and Patricia had asked, but coming from my mother, it carried a different weight. Eleanor Henderson had built her identity around being the matriarch of a successful family. The idea that her failed daughter had surpassed them all financially was challenging the very foundations of how she saw herself in the world. Work, Mom, hard work, smart decisions, and lots of time invested in building something from scratch. Every word was chosen to emphasize that I had done this alone, without family help, without using the Henderson name to open doors. Remember the blog I started about finances? The one Dad said was a phase I'd grow out of. The discomfort on her face told me she remembered perfectly. That blog has grown into a company valued at over $120 million, I continued, letting the number fully register before continuing. I have 320,000 paying clients, a team of 40 employees, and partnerships with the largest banks in the country. I'm regularly invited to speak at Wall Street conferences about democratizing investing. Each fact was a piece of the puzzle my family had never cared to put together, but which they were now forced to confront. Eleanor set her coffee cup down on the table with slightly trembling hands. "Sarah, why didn't you ever tell us? Why did you keep all this a secret?" It was the third time she'd heard this question today, and it didn't get any less frustrating with the repetition. "Mommy, did you ever ask about my work beyond polite comments about my cute blog? Did you ever show genuine interest in what I was building?" The question made her flinch slightly, as if she'd been physically touched. "We've always been interested in your life, dear." The words sounded hollow even to her. "Mommy, when was the last time you were here? Not for a special occasion, not because you felt obligated, but because you genuinely wanted to spend time with me." I saw the exact moment she realized she couldn't answer the question. 3 years, I answered for her. "It was 3 years ago, on my 39th birthday. You stayed exactly 45 minutes, took 3 work calls from Dad, and left saying you had an important dinner." "I remember," she said softly, her voice carrying something that might have been regret. "But Sarah, you have to understand, we had our own lives, our own responsibilities. Your father's business, Patricia's children, Derek's career, and me?" I interrupted. Where did I fit into all of this? What was my role in the family other than being the daughter you quietly worried about? The question hung in the air like an accusation, because that's exactly what it was. Eleanor was silent for several minutes, staring at her clasped hands. When she finally looked up, I saw something I'd never seen before on my mother's face. Genuine vulnerability. Sarah, we made terrible mistakes. We underestimated you. We neglected you. And now, she gestured vaguely, as if unable to find the words to describe the enormity of the situation. Now we discover that our daughter is more successful than any of us ever imagined. Not just more successful, Mom, I corrected gently. More successful than you specifically, individually and collectively. It was cruel to say, but it was the truth, and she needed to hear it. I built a financial empire while you were too busy with your own lives to notice. And now you want to be a part of it because you discovered it exists. The accusation was implicit but clear. Is that what you think of us? She asked, her voice breaking slightly. That we only care about you now because we found out you're rich? It was an honest question that deserved an honest answer. Mommy, you didn't invite me to Christmas, the most important family gathering of the year, and I wasn't included. How do you think that made me feel? And now, less than 24 hours after finding out about my financial situation, the whole family is at my door. The timeline spoke for itself. Eleanor closed her eyes as if physically wounded by my words. Sarah, not inviting you to Christmas was the biggest mistake we've ever made as a family. There's no excuse for it. There's no justification. It was the most honest admission I'd ever heard from any member of my family, and for a moment I felt my resolve waver. But decades of emotional neglect couldn't be erased with an admission, even a sincere one. Mommy, she finally said, you have much more than $5 million. Why are you so shocked by the money? She looked at me with a strange expression, as if the question had multiple layers she was trying to decipher. It's not about the amount, honey. It's about what it means, about who you've become without us realizing it. It's about us completely losing our youngest daughter. Her words carried an emotional weight I hadn't expected, and for the first time that day, I felt my eyes fill with tears. I took a deep breath, forcing back the tears. This was no time for weakness, even if it was hard to resist the first genuine display of emotional vulnerability my mother had shown in years. You didn't lose me, Mom. You discarded me. The words came out harsher than I intended, but they were necessary. For 15 years, I was here, trying to prove myself, trying to show that I deserved a place in this family. And you were so busy with your own lives that you didn't even notice when I stopped trying. Eleanor flinched as if slapped, her hands tightening on the strap of her Hermes bag until her knuckles turned white. Sarah, dear, we always knew you deserved a place in the family. You're our daughter, Am I? I interrupted, standing and walking to the window. Because from my memories of the last 5 years, I feel more like a distant acquaintance you tolerate out of familial obligation than like a daughter or a sister. I looked down at the street, where normal life continued. People returning from work, children playing, dogs being walked. A real, authentic life, very different from the carefully orchestrated performance my family called a relationship. Do you remember my MBA graduation? I asked, still staring out the window. I got a full scholarship to Columbia, graduated with honors, and you were 15 minutes late because you stopped for dinner at a nice restaurant on the way. The memory still stung, even after all these years. And when you arrived, Dad spent the entire ceremony checking email on his phone, and you were chatting with other families about how much the hall decorations cost. It was a small detail, but representative of how they always treated my achievements as secondary events in their busy lives. Eleanor turned on the couch to face me, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with something that might have been desperation. Sarah, we were proud of you. We always were. Maybe we didn't show it the way you needed, but proud. The word came out as a bitter laugh. Mom, you didn't even know I existed professionally until last night. Proud of what exactly? Of the daughter you thought was living paycheck to paycheck in a cheap apartment in Queens. We never thought your apartment was cheap, she protested weakly. We just assumed you were living within your means, and that those means were limited. The word limited hung in the air between us like an involuntary confession. That was exactly how they saw me. Limited in ambition, limited in ability, limited in potential. And you never questioned those assumptions. You never asked if maybe you were wrong about my situation. You're right, Eleanor said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. We should have asked. We should have paid more attention. We should have been better parents. The admission hung between us like a fragile bridge over a chasm of years of hurt. It was the kind of acknowledgement I'd longed for decades. But now that it was finally happening, it felt simultaneously like a victory and an irreparable loss. I returned to the armchair and sat down, studying my mother's face. Eleanor Henderson had aged in recent years. Lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. A tension in her mouth that spoke of stress and worry. For the first time, she looked less like the invincible matriarch I'd always known, and more like a 62-year-old woman who had just realized she'd fundamentally failed one of her daughters. Mommy, what do you want from me now? Do you want me to pretend the last 15 years didn't happen? We want our daughter back, she replied immediately, as if the words had been stuck in her throat waiting to come out. We want the chance to really know you, to understand who you've become, to be a part of your life the way we should have been from the beginning. Her words were beautiful, but 15 years too late. What if I don't want you to be a part of my life? I asked bluntly. What if I decide it's too late to rebuild the bridges you've burned? The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. This one carried the weight of a real possibility, that maybe it really was too late, that some wounds were too deep to heal. Eleanor looked at her hands, and for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed lost, without a plan or strategy to navigate the situation. It would be understandable if you felt that way, she finally said. We don't deserve a second chance. Not after what we've done. No, I agreed. You don't deserve it. The harshness of the words made her shiver, but I continued. But maybe, just maybe, I'm willing to consider giving you a chance anyway. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to have a family that values me for who I am, not what I have. It was an offer, but it came with conditions that she would have to figure out for herself. Eleanor looked up, and I saw a glimmer of what might be hope. What would that mean? A second chance? The question was careful, as if she were afraid that the wrong words might make the offer disappear. It would mean starting over, I replied. Getting to know each other as adults, not as the familiar roles we've assumed for decades. It would mean you having to genuinely take an interest in my life, not just when it's convenient for you. And it would mean, I continued, my voice gaining strength, that you would have to accept that I don't need you. Financially, emotionally, professionally, I've built a complete life without you. If you want to be a part of it, it will be because I choose to include you, not because you expect to be included automatically. It was a complete reversal of traditional family dynamics, and I could see Eleanor processing the implications. That's fair, she said after a long moment. More than fair, considering. There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was filled with a humility I'd never heard before. Sarah, can I ask you a question? About Michael. The change of subject caught me off guard, but I nodded. Did he always know? About your success, about how much money you were making. The question made me smile for the first time that day. Mom, Michael was my first investor, my first employee, and my biggest supporter. He edited my first videos, helped me design my first logo, and worked double shifts so I could put every penny I earned back into the company. The reality about Michael was so different from my family's perception that it was absurd. He has a master's degree in engineering, speaks 3 languages, and his workshops are some of the most technologically advanced in the state. Eleanor stopped breathing for a moment. He has a master's degree? The incredulity in her voice would be comical if it weren't so revealing of my family's prejudices. In mechanical engineering from Cooper Union, with honors. Every word was chosen for maximum impact. He's also a silent partner in Finance for All. He owns 15% of the company. The number made her blink several times, clearly doing mental calculations about how much 15% of a company valued at $120 million was worth. $18 million, he said softly, doing the math for her. Michael is worth $18 million, not counting his own companies. It was delightful to see the expression on my mother's face as she processed that the simple mechanic they had despised for years was actually richer than any of them. And you treated him like he was inferior for 15 years of marriage. Oh my God, Eleanor murmured, covering her face with her hands. Sarah, what have we done? What have we done to you two? It was a rhetorical question, but I answered anyway. You've shown exactly who you are as people. You judged others by their appearance, their social status, their class prejudices, and now you're finding out you are wrong about literally everything. The conversation had taken a turn I hadn't anticipated, but I was pleased with where we'd gotten to. My phone rang, shattering the moment. It was Michael, probably worried because I hadn't responded to his messages in the past few hours. Excuse me, I said to my mom, answering the call. Hi, love. His familiar voice brought a wave of comfort I didn't know I needed. How were the conversations with your family? Are you okay? The genuine concern in his voice was a stark contrast to the carefully calculated interactions I'd had throughout the day. I'm fine, I replied, looking at Eleanor, who was watching my conversation with a strange expression on her face. Mom's here now. We're talking. Michael immediately understood the complexity hidden in that simple statement. Do you need me to come home? He asked, and the offer of unconditional support sent a wave of love through me for this man my family had sorely underestimated. No, it's fine, but thank you for offering. I hung up the phone and looked at my mother, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. He really loves you, she said softly, as if the observation surprised her. Of course he loves me, I replied. We've been married for 15 years. He's my best friend, my business partner, and the man who believes in me unconditionally. That's how marriages work when they're built on solid foundations. The statement hung in the air between us, laden with implicit comparisons to family relationships built on assumptions, judgments, and conditional love. Eleanor seemed to be processing not only the revelations about my financial situation, but also the depth of the errors of judgment she and the rest of the family had made about every aspect of my life. Eleanor was silent for several minutes, staring at the coffee cup in her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, softer, devoid of the natural authority she always carried. Sarah, I need to tell you something. Something that might explain, though not justify, some of our misperceptions. She took a deep breath, as if preparing for a difficult confession. After you married Michael and moved to Queens, your father and we talked about you, about your choices, and we decided it was best not to interfere, not to offer unsolicited help, so as not to appear condescending. The irony was so thick it could be cut with a knife. You decided not to interfere, I repeated slowly. So instead you just ignored me. The twisted logic of the situation was beginning to reveal itself like an onion being peeled back. Layer after layer of misunderstandings, misplaced assumptions, and misplaced family pride. We thought we were respecting your independence, she continued, her voice growing smaller with each word. We thought you'd come to us if you needed help. But when you never did you assume I didn't need you because I was doing well, or because I was doing too badly to admit it? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We assumed you were struggling but had too much pride to ask for help, Eleanor admitted, the words coming out like a forced confession. And as the years went by, it became easier to keep your distance than to confront what we might have lost. It was the most honest admission I'd ever heard from any member of my family, and also the most devastating. They had consciously chosen emotional cowardice rather than risk being rejected by me. So you created a narrative, I said, the pieces finally falling into place. Where I was the daughter too proud to ask for help, and you were the parents too respectful to force it, and that narrative allowed everyone to feel good about their mutual neglect. Eleanor closed her eyes, as if my words were physical blows. When put that way, yes, and now we realize how foolish we were, how we wasted years we can never get back. The sound of the doorbell interrupted our conversation. Through the window, I saw the rest of the family gathered on my porch. My father, Derek, Patricia, Jennifer, and even Patricia's twins, who rarely showed up at family events. It was like a carefully orchestrated invasion, or perhaps a last-ditch effort to confront the situation as a whole family unit. "Looks like the full committee has arrived," I muttered, getting up to answer the door. "Sarah," Eleanor said quickly, taking my arm, "before you open the door." "The money. The $5 million. What do you want us to do with it?" It was an interesting question, one I hadn't fully considered. "Keep it," I replied. "Consider it a consulting fee for the most expensive lesson you've ever received in family assumptions." She blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "Or donate it to charity, or burn it. Frankly, Mom, $5 million means nothing to me compared to what this conversation has meant." I opened the door and found my entire family huddled on the small porch like refugees seeking shelter. My father, Robert Henderson, stood in front, his hands clasped behind his back in the formal posture he always adopted when he was nervous. Derek seemed to have aged a decade since our earlier conversation, and Patricia was visibly trying to maintain her composure, though her red eyes suggested she'd been crying. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice politely neutral. "Sarah," my father began, his voice carrying a humility I'd never heard before. "We came as a family to talk, to try to understand, to ask for forgiveness." The words came out formally as if he'd rehearsed this speech, but there was an underlying sincerity that was impossible to ignore. "And we've come to the conclusion that we need to listen to you. Really listen for the first time in a long time. Come in," I said, stepping away from the door. Watching my entire family squeeze into my modest apartment was surreal. They looked like fish out of water, examining every detail like anthropologists studying an alien culture. Patricia's twins, Tyler and Madison, now 15, looked around with the unabashed curiosity of teenagers. It was their first time in my apartment, and probably their first time visiting Queens for any purpose. "Aunt Sarah," Tyler said hesitantly, "Derek told us about your company, about how much money you made. That's amazing." There was genuine admiration in his voice, the kind of admiration I'd never received from the adults in the family. "Is it true you're richer than Grandpa?" Madison added with the brutal frankness only teenagers can muster. The question made all the adults shift uncomfortably, but I smiled. "It's true," I replied simply. "Much richer." The confirmation caused an awkward silence in the room. Robert Henderson had spent his entire life as the family's financial patriarch, the man who controlled the purse strings and made the important monetary decisions. The idea that his youngest daughter had surpassed his wealth was not only shocking, it was a fundamental inversion of the family hierarchy he knew. "Sarah," my father said finally, "Derek told us about your company, about the numbers, about everything." He paused, as if the words were difficult to form, and we realized that not only did we fail to support you, but we also failed to recognize who you really are. His words carried the weight of decades of lost father-daughter bonding, of conversations never had, of paternal pride never expressed. "Dad," I replied carefully, "you didn't just fail to support me. You actively devalued me. There's a difference." The distinction was important. Passive neglect was one thing, active contempt was another. And now, because you found out I have money, you want to recalibrate our relationship. But where were you when I needed emotional support instead of financial support? Patricia stepped forward, her hands wringing nervously. "Sarah, we know we've made mistakes. Big mistakes. But we're family. That has to count for something." It was the same word, family, she'd used earlier on the phone. like a magical talisman supposed to erase years of neglect. Patricia, being family means being there for each other. It means celebrating successes and supporting each other through failures. When have you ever done either of those things for me? We're here now, Derek offered weakly. We're trying to do the right thing. The statement, though sincere, was 15 years too late. You're here because you found out I'm rich, I corrected. Not because you realized you hurt me. Not because you missed me, but because my financial situation forced you to reconsider your assumptions about me. Jennifer, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. Sarah, I know I have no right to speak, but I always thought you were amazing, and I always wondered why the family didn't see it. Her words caught me off guard. Jennifer had always been peripheral to the family dynamics, the wife who smiled politely and rarely offered opinions. I saw how smart you were, how you had interesting ideas, and I never understood why everyone acted like you were lesser, somehow. Thank you, Jennifer, I said sincerely. That means a lot to hear. And it did, more than I expected. Sometimes validation from unexpected sources can be the most powerful. What about you? I asked, looking around the room at the rest of the family. What do you see when you look at me now? The same old person or someone different because they found my bank account? The silence that followed was telling. I could see the gears turning in their heads, struggling with the realization that I was exactly the same person I'd always been. They'd simply chosen not to see me. You're the same person, my mother finally said. We're the ones who were blind. It was a simple admission, but it carried the weight of years of lost relationships. So here's my proposal, I said, standing and positioning myself where everyone could clearly see me. You want a second chance? You want to be a part of my life? Then prove it. Not with words, not with expensive flowers or extravagant gifts, but with consistent actions over time. Every word was carefully chosen, designed to establish clear, non-negotiable expectations. That means calling because you want to know how I am, not because it's my birthday and you feel obligated. It means asking about my work because you're genuinely interested, not because you want to impress others with the family success. It means including Michael and me in your lives not as charity projects, but as equal members of this family. I paused, letting the conditions sink in, and it means accepting that I don't need you. If I choose to have you in my life, it will be a gift I give you, not a right you have over me. The room was completely silent for several minutes. Finally, Tyler broke the silence with the brutal honesty of adolescence. That seems fair, he said, looking around at the adults. You guys really treated Aunt Sarah badly. Madison nodded vigorously. And Uncle Michael, too. I remember you guys making jokes about him being a mechanic. The remark made all the adults shift uncomfortably, confronted with their prejudices through the eyes of their own children. I looked around the room at each member of my family, truly seeing them perhaps for the first time in years, not through the lens of pain or resentment, but as flawed people who had made terrible mistakes but were perhaps still capable of growing. The choice is yours, I finally said. You can have a rich daughter and sister who tolerates you out of obligation, or you can work to have a daughter and sister who chooses you every day because you deserve to be chosen. But you can't have both. When they left 2 hours later, there were no guarantees or grandiose promises, just a tacit understanding that everything had changed, not just because of the money, but because of the truths that had been spoken and heard. The envelope containing $5 million was still on the table when Michael got home, and he laughed when I explained the symbolism. So, he said, pulling me into a hug, they finally figured out who you really are. No, I corrected, nestling into his arms. They figured out how much money I have. Finding out who I really am, that's going to take a lot longer. But for the first time in 15 years, I had hoped that they might be willing to do the work. The real test wouldn't be whether they could accept my financial success, but whether they could love and value the person I'd always been, before the money, before the fame, before everything. Just Sarah Henderson, a woman who dared to build something extraordinary and discovered that the most precious gift she could give wasn't money, but the opportunity to start over. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in decades, there were possibilities where before there had been only resignation. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth more than all the millions in the world.